Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Bear with me a moment. I'm just getting set up. We will be doing a stream momentarily. I just need to pull up the notes I made and post things to Facebook so that people can tune in. Almost there. Bear with me. One more thing to do. Downloads. Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. As always, I'm your host, Kevin Mears, demonologist and Paranormal Encyclopedia. I've been promising for a while that I was going to do an episode about the origins of the novel Frankenstein, and it's gotten pushed back and turned around and every which way but loose. But the time has finally come to talk about exactly where Mary Shelley got the idea for what is one of, if not the most important novels in the Gothic horror genre. As much as I love Dracula, Frankenstein invented science fiction. It's a pretty bloody important book. It's also an incredibly good book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. Hello, Teresa Hall, Gulf City Pagan. Yes, I'm a man of my word. I said I'd be doing it, and I am. I also want to draw attention to my t-shirt, which is, just because you are paranoid doesn't mean there isn't an invisible demon about to eat your face, which is a quote from the Dresden Files. It is one of 3 t-shirts that my fiancée Misha got me for my birthday 2 weeks ago. They took quite a while. They only just got here, but I wanted to wear this. So, before I get into where she got the idea, let me talk a little bit about Mary Shelley and the origins of the novel itself, which are pretty interesting. So Mary Shelley had an interesting childhood, I think, because she was the daughter of 2 very significant individuals. Her father, Goodwin, I'll look up his full name in a second, so I'll start with her mother instead. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was in many ways considered the first real feminist. She was a philosopher. She had written on the defense of women. She was an incredibly important figure in and of herself. Her father was William Goodwin, who was a political philosopher. So both were very intellectual people, very intelligent. We're talking about the 18th and 19th centuries. And life, unfortunately, actually started with some tragedy, because her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, died less than a month after she was born because of complications from the birth. Mary Wollstonecraft had chosen to go with a natural birth. This, unfortunately, was 1797. Things just weren't where they are today, and there were complications in the birth, and she died before Mary ever got to know her. Mary herself would ultimately travel. She would famously get into a relationship and eventually marry one of the greatest poets of the Romantic era, which would, of course, be Percy Shelley. But her life started, in many ways, I think, with this tragedy of her mother dying. And I would think then a couple other things that influenced her. So the 2 big years are 1815 and 1816. In 1815, there's a major volcanic eruption at Krakatoa. It throws a huge amount of volcanic ash into the air and throws the world into basically a mini nuclear winter. The ash blots out the sun. It drastically changes temperatures, changes weather patterns for the next year. That is why 1816 is famously known as the year without a summer, the year that the year of basically froze to death, and a whole bunch of other creative names. Because instead of a summer that year, it was cold. There were thunderstorms, and rain, and hail, and things like that all through the summer. And this is important to the origins of Frankenstein because, as I said, Mary and her was at the time dating by Shelley. Both of them were friends. They were traveling through Europe. They had traveled through Germany. This is important later, and they were friends with another one of the greatest writers of the age, Lord George Gordon Byron. The man famously referred to by Lady Caroline Lamb as bad, dangerous to know. And there's some funny things that happen with traveling and various practical jokes they would play on people and various places that they would stay. But they decide for the summer of 1816 they're going to get together at the Via okay. I should have written this. I made a whole bunch of notes, and there's certain things that I forgot to write down because I'm like that. But anyway, they decided to get together at Lake Geneva with Lord Byron. At the Via Diodati. Apparently, there were 5 people that got together. There was Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, or Mary Wollstonecraft. She wasn't Mary Shelley yet. Lord Byron, of course. Lord Byron's personal physician, John Polidori. And this is one a lot of people overlook. But Mary's half-sister, Claire Clairmont, was also there. And the group of them got together with the plan that they'd be writing, boating on the lake, long talks in the night. Later in 1831, Mary would remember the summer as an incessant rain and often confined us for days to the house. So they're stuck inside because the weather's absolutely miserable. And they're bored. And again, this is a group of it's a bunch of writers. Mary is most famous for writing Frankenstein, but she actually continued to write throughout her life. She also wrote possibly the first post-apocalyptic novel, The Last Man in the World. She wrote a number of travel logs and things of that nature. Dorsey and Byron churned out a ton of poetry, and Polidori, while he wrote something particularly important we're going to get to, wrote a number of other novels. As far as I know, Claire Clairmont didn't write a whole lot. But anyway, they're stuck inside, sitting around a log fire, and they're amusing themselves by reading a book called Phantasmagoria, which is a French translation of a book of German ghost stories. And Byron gets an idea that they should each write their own ghost story. And this is where things get particularly interesting, in my opinion, because Byron starts what's known as Fragment of a Novel. It's a novel he was going to write about a vampire, and he got bored and he never finished it. Polidori picks up. Polidori did a short ghost story, essentially, but he also picks up the Fragment of a Novel and runs with it, and writes the novel known as The Vampire, which is the first vampire novel written in the English language. There are other stories that involve vampire-like creatures. There's certainly poems like Coleridge's Christabel, which use very vampiric imagery, as well as many poems written by Byron himself. But this is the first time a character is explicitly identified as a vampire in a novel, and the vampire in question, Lord Riven, is unabashedly based on Lord Byron. Percy Shelley and Claire Claremont quickly grew bored, and as far as anyone knows, didn't write anything. But Mary's having an issue. According to her writings, she says every morning she's being asked at breakfast, "Have you thought of a story?" And she's embarrassed to have to say no. Then one mid-June evening, she overhears a discussion between Byron and Shelley, and they discuss galvanism. Now, galvanism is a chemical process for creating electricity. It was discovered by Luigi Galvani, who was an Italian physicist and biologist. His nephew, Giovanni Aldini, would continue his work and famously used it in the late 19th century on an executed prisoner in London. According to reports, it caused the body's muscles to become violently contorted and even one of the eyes open. According to Mary's own notes, this inspires her to have a nightmare. She actually describes the nightmare. "I saw with shut eyes, but acute mental vision. I saw the pale student of the unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out. And then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life, stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion." This dream, along with some other issues, probably the fact that Mary had lost her own child the year before, perhaps the death of her mother, inspires her on one dreary summer afternoon to start writing Frankenstein. She originally saw it as a short story, but Percy actually encouraged her to expand it longer, and it became Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus, which would be published in 1818. She described the summer in Switzerland as the moment when she first stepped out from childhood into life. And Frankenstein has, of course, become one of the most adapted stories ever written, one of the most popular characters in fiction other than Sherlock Holmes and Dracula themselves. And there's something interesting about that I also wanted to point out, which isn't really relative to the story of where she got the idea, but it's still kind of funny. So the very first theatrical production of Frankenstein was called Presumption, The Fate of Frankenstein. It was performed in 1823 in London for the very first time. At what would become a particularly famous theater that's sort of important to the history of horror in its own right, the Lyceum Theater. At the time, Lyceum wasn't particularly important to horror, but it would eventually, I don't know if it was at the time, but it would eventually be owned by a very famous actor by the name of, excuse me, dang it, I'm forgetting his name. I know his name and I'm forgetting it. It's one of those things. Here go. William Irving. And then in 1878, Irving hires an Irishman to manage his theater. The first theater to ever show a production of Frankenstein is the same theater that would eventually be managed by none other than Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula. That's an interesting coincidence, don't you think? There's a bunch of other interesting things that go into the writing of Dracula. For example, when the novel was first published in 1823, no one she didn't take credit for it. In fact, the only name that was on it at all was that Percy Shelley wrote the preface for the novel. So a lot of people assumed that he had written it. But to his credit, Percy was very quick to give Mary credit for the book. This also incidentally happened with The Vampire in Lord Byron, in that originally The Vampire was published anonymously, and because Riven was so clearly based on Lord Byron, a lot of people assumed that Byron had written it, and he was very quick to correct them and go, no, Paul Dory wrote it. So the question becomes then, where did Mary get the idea? Do we know? Is there any way we can know? And there is actually a couple of stories, a couple of hints at what might have inspired her. There are, in fact, 2 Castle Frankensteins in Germany. And while there's no evidence she ever visited either, there is one that may have inspired her. Because it's near the Rhine River, which we know that she traveled across from her journals. And there's a man that lived there who was known as Joseph Conrad Dippel. Dippel was an alchemist, and I'll get back into this in a minute. But he was supposedly a grave robber, and then he supposedly experimented with dead bodies. Well, Dippel wasn't a member of the Frankenstein family, hence his name is Dippel. He had been born in the castle, in the town that the castle is associated with, and frequently, as was custom at the time, would refer to himself as the Frankensteiner. It is possible, although by no means certain, that this story inspired Mary Shelley. And it's worth noting, people tend to think of the story of the novel Frankenstein and that how Frankenstein created the monster was with lightning or electricity in some way. Now, the novel never says this, although it does certainly imply it, and certainly that's for the nightmare that started this whole thing was the experiments with galvanism further implies it. The only thing the novel says at all is that it was a combination of chemistry and alchemy, which makes sense if you know anything about alchemy. When people think of alchemy, they think of changing metal, making lead into gold, which is accurate. This is one of the thing to understand about alchemy is it's not. Principles used in alchemy would go on to inspire chemistry and toxicology, but it itself is not chemistry. It is a form of magic, not science. The premise of alchemy is spiritual. Alchemists were moving impurities, physical and spiritual impurities. They believed that all metals were essentially the same thing. Less valuable metals like lead were very impure. If you could remove the impurities, you get a more valuable, more pure metal. So yes, you could take, working with lead, you could remove its impurities and eventually you would get silver or gold or some other very valuable metal. This was not me, though. This was by and large what they gave to the nobles and the kings and things of that nature to give them money to do the research they actually wanted to do. So the actual goal in the body and the soul, we could live forever. And there are a number of alchemists throughout history that have claimed to achieve this goal. The most famous by far, particularly thanks to Harry Potter, would be a very real alchemist by the name of Nicholas Flamel. Nicholas Flamel was an actual person who claimed to have created the Philosopher's Stone, and I'll get back to that in a minute, claimed to have achieved immortality, claimed to have been able to turn base metals into gold. And the the offshoot, and why this relates to the story of Frankenstein and the story of Dipple, is that alchemists were trying to create life. Specifically, they were trying to create a form of living thing known as homunculus. Homunculuses were tiny people that looked like human beings. Became very popular in the 16th century. But basically, it was a miniature, fully formed person. There is, in fact, a story from Paracelsus where he describes his creation of homunculus. That the sperm of a man be purified by itself in a sealed cucurbit for 40 days with the highest degree of putrefaction in a horse's womb, or at least so long that it comes to life and moves itself and stirs, which is easily observed. After this time it will look somewhat like a man, but transparent without a body. If after this it be fed wisely with the arcanum of human blood, and be nourished up for 40 weeks, and be kept in the even heat of a horse's womb, a living human child grows therein, with all of its members like another child, which is born of a woman, but it much smaller. Paracelsus is an actually absolutely fascinating figure in his own right. He was an alchemist, a doctor, a scientist, an early scientist essentially, and a magician. And his work was extremely important to the history of medicine, in the fact that he was one of the first scientists, or the first doctors at least, to realize that the four humors theory of medicine, the idea that there are four humors in the body, the blood, the cholera, the caloric, and all these other things. Blood, caloric, phlegmic, and I forget the fourth one, but it doesn't matter. But basically, that when they were out of balance, that was the cause of disease. This is what led to bleeding and using leeches, because you have too much blood, you have to drain the blood out, which is of course nonsense. But this was taken very seriously for 100 years, and people died. But he was one of the first people to realize that he would recommend the use of herbs and things that actually did work. He was also, in many ways, the father of the science of toxicology. He's famously paraphrased. There's a longer quote, which I'm not going to quote, mostly because I don't want to drag things out by looking it up again. But he's famously paraphrased as saying, "All things are poison save the dose," which deals with the fact that just about any substance in excess will kill you. But that's the idea of the homunculus, which is also definitely part of the origin of Frankenstein. If you're curious about the idea of the homunculus, there is a very old classic black and white horror movie, The Bride of Frankenstein, and you can actually see homunculi in that movie. Homunculus is a singular, homunculi is the plural, if you're wondering why I keep using those terms back and forth. But there's another concept which comes out of Jewish folklore that was also probably an inspiration, which is the golem. The idea of the golem goes all the way back to the book of Genesis. If you remember, if you go back to the book of Genesis in the Bible, when it describes the creation of Adam, God forms him from dust or clay that breathes life into him. And Adam, and this is how he creates the first human. A golem is generally the same idea. It's a person made out of clay that is given life through Kabbalah, which is a Jewish system of mysticism. The first record we have of someone trying to make a golem is a Babylonian rabbi by the name who supposedly made a man. You can find a reference to that not in the Bible itself, but in the Talmud, in Sanhedrin 65b. Another very early, the earliest known account of how a golem made specific. So that just as he made a person, he made a golem. But the first account of how to do it, the process, is in the Sodi Razaya from Rabbi Eliezer ben Judah. And I apologize, I don't speak Hebrew. I know I'm butchering pronunciations here. which comes from the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Now, the most famous golem by far, and probably the one that most influenced Shelley, is the Golem of Prague. And I'll get back to that in a minute, but I wanted to share, because interestingly enough, there's a slightly older, well-known story of the creation of a golem, which happened in Poland. It's supposedly happened sometime between 1630 and 1650 with a Polish rabbi by the name of Elihu. He was also a Kabbalist. And we actually have a description of what happened. And I have heard in a certain and explicit way from several respectable persons that one man living close to our time, whose name is R. Elihu, the master of the name, who made a creature out of matter and form, and performed hard work for him for a long period, and the name of Imet was hanging about his neck till he finally removed it for a certain reason, and the name for his neck, and it turned to dust. In 1748, Rabbi Jacob Emden went further. As an aside, I'll mention to you that I heard from my father's holy mouth regarding the golem created by his ancestor, Gaon R. Elihu Baal Shem of blessed memory. When Gaon saw that the golem was growing larger and larger, he feared that the golem would destroy the universe, and he then removed the holy name that was embedded in his forehead, thus causing him to disintegrate and return to dust. Nonetheless, while he was engaged in extracting the holy name from him, the golem injured him, scarring him in the face. Now, by far the most famous creation of golem supposedly happened in Prague, and it was the work of Rabbi Lo ben Bazlel. And he made it to protect the Jews of the city of Prague from anti-Semitism and pogroms that were being brought about by Joseph II, the Holy Roman Emperor. Supposedly, this golem went a bit further. Normally, golems are tall, strong, very hard to kill because they're made out of rock, essentially. But another very important thing, and it's a recurring theme, is they can't speak. But this one, on the other hand, could become invisible and summon spirits of the dead. Now, the story goes that that there was a shell, a piece of paper, that would be put in the golem's mouth, which is what brought it to life. But of course, the rabbi, being a proper rabbi, would take the paper out on Friday nights and put it back Saturday, Sunday, because of they're Jewish. Friday sundown to Saturday sundown is Sabbath in Judaism. If you didn't know, I'm betting most of you do, because I have very intelligent listeners. But this golem, interestingly enough, is supposed to have eventually got on a murderous rampage, possibly, depending on which version of the story you read, because it had fallen in love with a human woman who had rejected it. And then it became enraged. Because it was hideous and not human, and it becomes enraged and goes off and just starts killing people. A couple of common elements you find is that usually with a golem, the name Emet or one of the names of God will be written on the forehead or put in an amulet around the neck or put on a piece of paper in the mouth. To destroy a golem's a little bit tricky. Usually you have to get the paper out of its mouth or take the amulet off, or perhaps most interestingly, Emet in Hebrew means truth. But Met, means dead. So it generally thought that you could erase the E on the forehead, changing truth to death, life to death, and kill the golem. Golems were generally seen, although there's the earlier story I had mentioned where it was created basically to be they're generally supposed to be warriors or protectors. They're created by taking river clay, shaping it into the form of a person, doing specific Kabbalistic rituals over it, and then writing Emet. This story, particularly the story of the Golem of Prague, is probably the biggest influence on Shelley. It's also interesting to note that the first written accounts of the Golem of Prague don't show up until the 19th century. So a number of historians think that it's just fiction. It's just something somebody invented. But there's enough anecdotal accounts and things of that nature that there's also a general feeling that the Golem is at least inspired by Jewish folklore. I have no way of knowing which is which. But yeah, that pretty much, Kippel, alchemy in general, and the Golem it's hard to know, and of course the galvanism experiments seem to be where Mary got the idea. It's hard to know for sure. We have very detailed notes, for example, with Dracula, where at least some of the idea, where Stoker got at least some of his ideas. We know the research he was conducting into Eastern European folklore and history. With Mary, it's a little harder to pin down. We don't have extensive records of her doing all these research. We don't really even have specific stories that match up. Dracula's a vampire. Vampires are found in folklore all over the world. Jekyll and Hyde, which is another one I should do at some point, is actually based on an actual serial killer by the name of Moody. It's not, I think even Stevenson admitted that. It's not hard to pin down at least some of the origins of those characters. But Frankenstein's a fairly original idea. There are certainly analogs in the homunculus and in the golem, but most stories of homunculi and golems don't involve the modern image of Frankenstein. Granted, a lot of the modern image of Frankenstein isn't found in the novel. There are certainly discussions of Frankenstein digging up dead bodies and performing some kind of experiments with them. But there's nothing in the novel talking about him stitching the parts of dead men together. Like I said, it's implied that electricity and possibly lightning had something to do with the animation, but it's never stated in the book. The only reason we can be certain that galvanism, or at least experiments of galvanism, was one of the inspirations for what happened is when Mary admitted it. She talked about the nightmare she had and about how it was influenced by the story of galvanism, and listening to Percy and Byron discussing these experiments. From there, it turns into a lot of speculation. It's kind of like, how much was Dracula the vampire inspired by Vlad the Impaler? The answer is probably not a whole lot, but every once in a while, from what I understand, thinkers found various hints that raise some interesting questions about that. But Frankenstein, it's harder to go, see, this is where it came from. Anyone who's listening, and this is probably going to be a short episode, I have to work tonight. That's the other thing I want to talk about is I think I'm going to start moving the show to during the week. My work schedule has changed. I'm now working overnights on weekends, so it's a little harder to do an episode on Saturday. So I might do it like Tuesday, Wednesday. But that's one of the other reasons it's probably going to be a shorter episode. Hey, Lisa for Truth, welcome. I'm glad to see you. Before I wrap up, I do want to see, does anybody have any questions about Frankenstein or any of the other stuff I got into tonight? Or in general, you don't have to be specific to the topic. I should also plug that I was very fortunate this week. I was invited. I was able to join in on my friend Virgo Triad's stream. You guys should definitely check out her channel if you haven't already. She's an awesome lady and has a great channel. And it was extremely sweet of her that she wanted to letting me talk about what I do far more than I would have expected, since it's not really her topic. Teresa is saying that Wednesdays would be great. Wednesdays are pretty good for me, so I might actually do it. The only question, I have a job interview for maybe another part-time, so I'm not on one part-time job on Monday. So I may want to see if my schedule changes maybe Wednesdays won't be good so good anymore. Or for that matter, if I stop being part-time, I don't know. I'm currently lacking information about what's going on. But Wednesdays are definitely a possibility. There's another series I'm debating doing. I don't want to go into details now, mostly because I keep saying I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, and I don't actually do it. So I don't want to get into something I'm thinking about doing and then not actually doing it again. But as I was saying, if you haven't read the novel, I recommend it. There are a number of excellent movies based on Frankenstein. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that came out, I don't remember when, but with Kenneth Branagh as Frankenstein and Robert De Niro as the monster was excellent. It was fairly truthful in the novel. There's elements that aren't in the novel. There's, of course, the original classic with Boris Karloff, and I'm sorry, but I love the original, very first Frankenstein. Well, the first Frankenstein with Boris Karloff, because I'll get to that in a minute. But there's the sequel, Bride of Frankenstein, which is in many ways a better movie. Although they're both pretty good movies. But the sequel actually gets into the big difference between the creature in the book and the creature in the movie, which is when most people think of Frankenstein, they think of Karloff in the first movie, where he's a big, lumbering, unintelligent being who just kind of grunts. Lisa, you'll have to go back and watch the video. I've spent the last half hour explaining where Shelley got the idea. It's a little too involved. I mean, it's mostly a nightmare she had, and then probably some inspiration from Legends of a guy by the name of Joseph Conrad Dipple and the Legends of the Golem. But the thing I was getting to is the big thing that separates Frankenstein the monster from what most people think of Frankenstein the monster is that in the book he's intelligent, he's well spoken, he actually quotes the Bible, he quotes John Milton. I think I could be wrong, it's been a while, but I think he even quotes a little bit of Shakespeare in there. And no, don't be sorry, you only just joined us. It's a perfectly fair question. But there is very much this idea that people have, and it's largely true, that the monster is far more the victim than the monster in the novel. I mean, he's not completely innocent. But he does commit murder out of revenge. But when he's created, Victor. Henry, I forget which one. The movies did one and then the book does the other, I forget. But Frankenstein immediately rejects him. He's horrified by him. The monster is given various names in the book, none of them particularly flattering. Damon, Fiend. The handsome thing, I thought he was actually supposed to be pretty ugly in the book, but again, it's been a while. But he's rejected by everybody. Horribly, and he goes to Frankenstein, and this is another common thing that people think, because it's always Dr. Frankenstein. He's not a doctor in the book. He does go to med school, but he doesn't actually finish it. He's not actually a medical doctor. That's why I just keep calling him Frankenstein instead of Dr. Frankenstein. The closest the official name for him. Although there's a point where he does mention that Frankenstein's as good a name as any because that was his creator's name. There's also a point when Frankenstein, the doctor, says to him, "You are my Adam," which is a common name that's been used for him in fiction. Personally, I think the best name I've seen for him is that's an interesting question, Teresa. Teresa says a movie I saw in the early 90s. Writing of Frankenstein, they partook in absinthe before writing. Do I know if that's true or if it's Creed of Liberty? I'm not certain. I will say, given Byron's nature, and the fact that Shelley and Mary were actually particularly for the time, fairly liberal. Mary started calling herself Mrs. Shelley before they ever got married. I've even found some references to that they believed in free love. I wouldn't rule out the idea that they took some absinthe first, though I've never seen that in any of the documentation I've read at the meeting, so I honestly couldn't say for certain. But I was going to say, I think my favorite name I've seen suggested for the monster is suggested by Dean Koontz in his series of novels about basically a modern Frankenstein called Duke Ellen. And I'm probably butchering that as well. What makes this such a clever name for the monster is the full name of the novel is Frankenstein, a Modern Prometheus. Prometheus, of course, being the famous titan in Greek mythology who steals fire from the gods to bring to mortals. And certainly that's the theme of the book, is taking this power, this knowledge that is only meant for God, and a mortal making use of it. Deucalion is the name of the son of Prometheus. Since Frankenstein is a modern Prometheus, it's certainly a logical follow-through that would be something to call the monster. In general, the monster or the creature is as good a name for it as any. It is definitely the story of something driven to evil more than created evil. Particularly when you look at the original request he makes that drives him into the murderous rage of, just create me someone so I don't have to be alone. And then Frankenstein nearly does it and then refuses to, and that's what sets him into his rage. But he is definitely a sympathetic creature. I'm very much of the opinion, as is most people today, that the real villain of the story is the scientist Frankenstein, not his creation. And it's like, if the creation had been treated better, maybe it wouldn't have been such a monster. And this is one of the beauties of the novel Frankenstein, and any good work of fiction, is it ties into deeper philosophical concepts. Case in point, there's definitely a whole argument here about the traditional question of nature versus nurture. Are we what we are because of what we're born, or in this case created, or are we that way because of what we experience? Could the creature have been good if he had been treated differently, or was the fact that he was created in this unnatural, blasphemous way meant he was always damned to be evil? As a Christian, I'm a big, to insert my 2 cents. As a Christian, I'm a big believer in redemption and free will and choice. So I'm personally inclined to think that the monster could have been better if it had been treated decently. And I think that's kind of where the novel's trying. I will also say that the most famous early film version is, of course, the Boris Karloff movie. Yes, absolutely true, Lisa. But the thing about that movie is it's not actually the first adaptation of Frankenstein. That was done in 1931, the very first version. And it's not even... There are a couple that happened before the 1931 version, Life Without a Soul, and The Monster, 1915, 1920 specifically. The very first was made by Edison Studios, written and directed by J. Cyril Dawley. It is very short. It's only 14 minutes. It's actually pretty faithful to the novel, despite being so short. But what's really quite nifty is, for a long time, the movie, the first adaptation of Frankenstein, and in general, one of the first films. I mean, this is 1910 by the company that is credited with creating the film. But it was thought to be lost for decades. In the 1950s, a print of the film was purchased by a Wisconsin film collector, Alois F. Detlaff, from his mother-in-law, who also collected films. He didn't realize the rarity until many years later. Its existence was first revealed in the 70s. Although somewhat deteriorated, this film was in viewable condition, complete with titles and tints, as they were seen in 1910. He had a 35mm copy made in the late 1970s, and did a DVD release of 1,000 copies. Then Beermeyer Media released the public domain film in restored condition on March 18th, 2010, with the novel called Edison's Frankenstein. And if you look up online, and I have, you can actually see the full film. It's here on YouTube. In fact, I'll put a link to the description. Or no, it's not on YouTube anymore. Never mind. Let's see if it's still available at the library. It should be, I would think. Available. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to put a link to the complete original, very first film version of Frankenstein at the Library of Congress. And I recommend you check it out. It's interesting from a historical perspective, just as the first version of Frankenstein, obviously. It's not a bad movie, particularly for what it is in the time period. So does anyone else have... Lisa made a comment I did want to share, furthering the story of Prometheus, that of course God, specifically Zeus of Reserves, punished Prometheus by having a giant eagle eat his liver until every day that he would die, and the next day he would come back and the liver would be eaten again, and he would die, and he'd come back until Heracles would ultimately free him, and Zeus would allow that to stand. But does anybody have any questions? Comments? Anything else they would like to add? Anything they would like to know? I am by no means an expert on the origins of Frankenstein. If you're interested, I would certainly recommend there is a book that was written by Raymond McNally, one of the men that was responsible for a lot of the research into Vlad the Impaler and his ties to Dracula, called The Search for Frankenstein. Just one second. In Search of Frankenstein. Oh, I'm sorry. And I've got who wrote it wrong. So In Search of Frankenstein, exploring the myths behind Shelley's monster, by Radu Florescu, who's the other gentleman, along with McNally, who wrote In Search of Frankenstein. It's a pretty good book. It gives you a lot of the information about the origin, what we know of the origins, about Mary's family life and history, and her relationship with Percy. And yes, Therese, I would recommend, and I'm planning. I may actually not read it again. I may do the unabridged audiobook, because there are multiple ones available on YouTube, because Frankenstein is, of course, a public domain novel. And I may listen to that. I like to listen to audiobooks, particularly. I get about a 20-minute drive back and forth. And it also sometimes, if I'm doing a video game or something like that, I like to have especially when I play older games, because I do happen to be a fan of some of the older ones where there isn't constant voiceovers. I'll do an audiobook in the background. But I think that's going to wrap it up for tonight. Folks, I want to thank you for listening in. If you enjoy what I'm doing and you haven't yet, I would ask you to like, comment, subscribe. I'm really trying to finally push up to get that 1,000 subscribers and enough watch time, so I'm finally going to be monetized. It's been 5 years, and I'm at 640 something. So if you could do that, if you could share this with your friends, I'd really appreciate it. Other ways you can help, if you have any questions, you can email me. The email is in the description below, as is linked to my Patreon, which is patreon.com/demonology. If you can spare anything, it would certainly help. Being cut to part-time and the various complications of the coronavirus are not going to make things easy on me. I'm okay at the moment. I mean, I'm not going to get kicked out. Don't think I'm saying that. But if you can help, it would be appreciated. If you can't, that's okay too. Like I said, the biggest thing you can always do to help that doesn't cost you anything is liking, sharing, commenting, subscribing. Hit that notification bell. But that's going to do it for tonight. I want to thank Lisa for Truth and Teresa Hall for keeping with me in the comments and keeping me awake and keeping things lively. I will have another show coming up. I haven't quite decided on a video. And worth noting, I probably won't be able to just because I get out of work at 6 in the morning. I usually come home and go to sleep pretty quickly. But Virgo Dryad, who've already mentioned, is going to apparently be live in the morning. So I definitely recommend folks check out her. Check out her channel, look her up. She's a great lady, really good live streams and videos in general, very informative and a lot of fun. Again, if you go to her live stream earlier this week, I was blessed enough to be able to be part of it. But that's going to do it for now. This is Kevin Mears. I want to say to everybody, thank you all for listening. Have a wonderful night and a wonderful week, and God bless.